I never imagined the woman I trusted most after my wife would betray that trust in the most unimaginable way. It started as an innocent mistake, just a fleeting touch in the dark, but what followed that night changed everything. The very next morning, her lingering gaze over breakfast was impossible to ignore. I thought I was in control of my life, but little did I know, the game had just begun. My life was, by all accounts, perfect, or so I thought. My wife, Fiona, and I had been married for 8 years. We had built a stable home, raising 2 beautiful children, Isa, our lively daughter, and Yuan, our curious little boy. Fiona was everything I could have asked for, loving, hard-working, and an incredible mother. I often found myself wondering how I got so lucky. Our home was usually filled with laughter and the comforting routines of family life. Weekends meant pancakes in the morning, movie nights in the living room, and long walks in the park. I loved the simplicity of it all. But behind the scenes, there were cracks, small and subtle but undeniable. The demands of raising 2 young children and Fiona's exhausting work hours had left little room for us. Intimacy was no longer spontaneous but planned, and even that often fell apart in the chaos of our lives. Morag, Fiona's mother, was a regular presence in our home. After losing her husband a few years ago, she spent more time with us, doting on the kids and helping out. She was lively, opinionated, and, even at her age, strikingly attractive. Her laughter filled the house, her energy almost contagious. She was always impeccably dressed, her hair dyed a warm auburn shade, and she carried herself with confidence. It was easy to see why people gravitated toward her. I never thought twice about her presence. To me, she was family, someone who had endured her share of hardships but remained resilient. She and Fiona had a close bond, often staying up late, chatting over cups of tea. Everything was comfortable, routine, until that night. That accidental touch under the covers shook me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. It was a mistake, an embarrassing misunderstanding. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But as days turned into weeks, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The way Morag glanced at me, her casual comments laced with something more, left me confused and on edge. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me craved the attention, the excitement. I was stepping into dangerous territory, but at the time, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt intoxicating. Let me know when you're ready to proceed to the rising tension segment. After that night, nothing felt the same. Morag and I pretended everything was normal, but there was an unspoken tension between us. It lingered in the air, subtle yet undeniable. I convinced myself it was just embarrassment on her part, or mine. But deep down, I knew it was more. The first signs were small and easy to dismiss. Morag's gaze seemed to linger a moment too long when we crossed paths in the hallway. Her laughter, which I had always found warm and inviting, now felt different. It was softer, more directed, as if meant only for me. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into her actions. But then came the deliberate moments, ones I couldn't explain away so easily. One afternoon, Fiona was out running errands, and the house was unusually quiet. I found Morag in the kitchen, washing dishes. She wore a casual blouse and skirt, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the way she stood, her movements deliberate and fluid, caught my attention. As I walked past her, our arms brushed, an innocent accident, I thought. Yet, when she turned to face me, her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was something else entirely, something that made my heart race. "Sorry," I mumbled, trying to laugh it off, but her gaze lingered on me before she smiled and turned back to the sink. That smile stayed with me the rest of the day, haunting me in ways I didn't understand. As days passed, these small encounters became more frequent. She would find reasons to stay close, a hand on my shoulder when she passed by, a casual touch on my arm as she handed me a plate. Every touch sent a jolt through me, and I hated myself for the way I started to anticipate them. Fiona, oblivious to the growing tension, carried on as usual, trusting her mother completely. And why wouldn't she? To her, Morag was family, someone who had stepped in to help whenever we needed. One evening, Fiona was putting the kids to bed, and I was alone in the living room. Morag joined me, sitting just a little too close on the couch. We were watching a show, or at least pretending to. The air between us was charged, heavy with unspoken words. She leaned over to adjust a pillow, her perfume filling the space between us. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt something I couldn't deny. It was wrong, but it was there, undeniable, electric, and dangerous. Fiona's voice calling out from the kids' room broke the moment, and Morag quickly stood, smoothing her skirt as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The line between us, the boundary that should never have been crossed, was starting to blur. Soon after, her invitations became more blatant, though still wrapped in a veil of plausibility. "Can you help me move the couch? It's too heavy for me alone," she asked one afternoon. As I bent down to help, our hands brushed, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she held my gaze, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. I froze, unsure of what to do, my heart pounding in my chest. Moments like these left me questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things, or if she was intentionally pushing boundaries. And yet, each time it happened, I found myself more drawn to her, unable to resist the pull of whatever was growing between us. It wasn't just the thrill of the forbidden. It was the way she made me feel seen, noticed in a way I hadn't felt in years. The tension between Morag and me had grown into something palpable, something neither of us could ignore. What began as fleeting glances and accidental touches had turned into a dangerous dance, each step pushing us closer to the edge of no return. I knew it was wrong, but the thrill of it, the forbidden nature of our connection, was intoxicating. One quiet afternoon, when Fiona had taken the kids to a birthday party, Morag and I were alone in the house. She was in the kitchen, cleaning the countertops, while I pretended to scroll through my phone in the living room. But my attention wasn't on my screen, it was on her. I could hear the soft hum of her movements, the rhythmic clinking of dishes, and it was almost impossible to resist the pull to join her. Summoning more courage than sense, I walked into the kitchen under the pretense of looking for a snack. Morag glanced up from her task, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "Hungry?" she asked, her tone light but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. I nodded, unable to form words. The way she looked at me, her eyes holding mine just a little too long, made my heart race. I moved past her to the fridge, brushing against her ever so slightly. It wasn't intentional, or at least that's what I told myself, but the brief contact sent a jolt through me. When I turned back, she was still standing there, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. "Let me get that for you," she said softly, stepping closer. Her hand grazed mine as she reached for the refrigerator door, and I froze. For a moment, we stood there, too close, the air between us charged with unspoken possibilities. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, the faint scent of her perfume filling the space between us. It was maddening. Then, as if testing the waters, she placed her hand on my arm. It was a simple gesture, innocent enough on the surface, but the weight of it was undeniable. I looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Her gaze held mine, steady and deliberate, as if daring me to take the next step. I don't know who moved first, maybe it was her, maybe it was me, but suddenly, the space between us disappeared. Her hand slid from my arm to my chest, her touch lingering, and I couldn't stop myself. I leaned in, my breath hitching as her lips met mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if we were testing the boundaries of what we had just crossed, but it quickly deepened, becoming something neither of us could control. When we finally pulled apart, her cheeks were flushed, her breathing uneven. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of what we had just done hung heavily in the air, but neither of us moved. Instead, she reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face, her touch lingering for just a moment too long. From that day on, everything between us shifted. The stolen glances and subtle touches became bolder, more deliberate. Every interaction was charged with an undercurrent of desire, each moment together a dangerous game of temptation and restraint. One evening, when Fiona was working late, Morag and I found ourselves alone again. This time, there was no pretense, no excuses. We were in the living room, the TV on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. She sat next to me on the couch, her body angled toward mine, her knee brushing against my leg. "I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't resist any longer. I reached for her, pulling her closer, and she melted into me, her lips finding mine in the dim light of the room. What followed was a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Each time we were alone, the tension between us became unbearable, and we gave in to the pull that had been building for weeks. Every touch, every kiss felt like both a sin and a salvation, a fleeting escape from the confines of our carefully constructed lives. But with each stolen moment, the stakes grew higher. We were playing a dangerous game, one that could unravel everything if we were caught. And yet, neither of us could stop. The thrill of the forbidden was too powerful, the connection between us too intense to ignore. Each time Fiona came home, we would snap back to reality, pretending nothing had happened. But the guilt weighed heavily on me, even as I found myself craving more. Morag, on the other hand, seemed almost fearless, her confidence unwavering as she navigated the precarious line we were walking. The line between us had been crossed, and there was no going back. All that was left was to see how far we could go before everything came crashing down. The night it all came crashing down started like any other. Fiona had taken the kids to visit her sister for the weekend, leaving Morag and me alone in the house. The moment felt surreal, an opportunity too perfect, too dangerous to ignore. The silence in the house was deafening, and the anticipation hung thick in the air. Morag was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, her movements deliberate and graceful. I watched her from the living room, every detail of her silhouette etched into my mind. She looked up, catching my gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she motioned for me to join her. I crossed the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the kitchen, she turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, though her words lacked conviction. Her gaze betrayed her, filled with the same longing I felt. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then tell me to stop," I murmured. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut as I closed the distance between us. The kiss was electric, filled with the weight of everything unsaid and everything we couldn't deny. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the moment. We froze, the reality of our situation crashing down around us. Fiona wasn't supposed to be back until the next day, but the unmistakable sound of her voice calling out to the kids was undeniable. Panic set in as Morag and I pulled apart, our breaths ragged. "Go," she hissed, motioning toward the back door. But there was no time. Fiona stepped into the house, her arms full of groceries, her expression shifting from surprise to suspicion as she took in the scene before her. Morag, flushed and flustered, stood near the counter, her wine glass clutched tightly in her hand. I was standing awkwardly near her, my shirt slightly untucked, and the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Fiona's eyes darted between us, her brow furrowing as she set the bags down on the counter. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Nothing," I replied too quickly, the lie tumbling from my lips before I could stop it. But Fiona wasn't convinced. Her gaze lingered on Morag, who avoided eye contact, her cheeks burning with guilt. Fiona took a step closer, her voice rising. "Why do you both look like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't?" she demanded. Morag stammered, searching for an excuse, but her usual confidence was nowhere to be found. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence was deafening, and it was clear that Fiona wasn't going to let this go. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling now. "What's going on?" The weight of the situation was unbearable. I knew there was no way out, no excuse that could explain away the tension between us. Morag finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what it looks like," she said, but the words only made Fiona more suspicious. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you didn't betray me like this." The pain in her voice was like a knife to my chest. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and unforgiving. Fiona's tears turned to anger as she stepped back, her voice rising. "How could you? With my own mother?" Morag, her face pale and stricken, tried to interject, but Fiona cut her off. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted both of you." The confrontation spiraled into chaos, Fiona's anger and betrayal filling the room. Morag retreated to the corner, her usual poise shattered, while I stood there, unable to defend myself. Every word Fiona hurled at me was deserved, every accusation cutting deeper than the last. "I can't believe this," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe the two people I loved most would do this to me." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Morag and I stood there, unable to look at each other, the weight of our actions crushing us both. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Fiona packed her bags and left with the kids the next day, refusing to speak to me. Morag, racked with guilt, moved out of the house, leaving a void that could never be filled. The home that had once been filled with laughter and love was now silent, a hollow shell of what it once was. In the weeks that followed, I was left to grapple with the consequences of my actions. The guilt was overwhelming, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me at every moment. Morag and I didn't speak again, the connection we had shared now a painful reminder of everything we had destroyed. Fiona filed for divorce, her trust in me shattered beyond repair. She refused to let me see the kids, and I couldn't blame her. I had ruined everything, my marriage, my family, my life, all for a fleeting moment of temptation. Looking back, I can't even explain why I let it happen. Maybe it was the thrill of the forbidden, the excitement of being noticed in a way I hadn't felt in years. But none of it was worth the pain I caused, the lives I destroyed. The moment of betrayal had been fleeting, but the consequences would last a lifetime. The days following Fiona's discovery were the darkest of my life. The silence in the house was unbearable, each quiet moment a reminder of the chaos I had caused. Fiona moved out with the kids within a week, leaving behind a void that felt impossible to fill. I would sit alone in the empty living room, staring at the remnants of a life I had destroyed. The laughter of my children, Fiona's presence, even the mundane routines we once shared, everything was gone. Fiona was firm in her decision. She refused to hear my apologies, my explanations. "There's nothing you can say to fix this," she had said, her voice hollow. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now held only pain and betrayal. She made it clear that trust, the foundation of our relationship, was irrevocably broken. Morag disappeared from our lives just as abruptly. The day after Fiona left, she packed her belongings and moved in with a distant relative. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, just a handwritten note left on the kitchen counter: "I'm sorry for everything. Please take care of yourself." It was as if she couldn't bear to face the aftermath of what we had done. Without them, the house felt cold and lifeless. I wandered through the empty rooms, haunted by memories of the life we once shared. The guilt was unbearable. Every corner of the house reminded me of what I had lost. The kitchen, where Fiona and I had shared countless meals and stolen moments of laughter, now felt like a place of betrayal. The living room, once filled with the sounds of family movie nights, was eerily silent. Work offered no solace. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I explain the weight I carried, the shame I felt? I threw myself into my job, hoping the distraction would dull the pain, but it never did. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my betrayal, every choice that led me to this point. Fiona's lawyers contacted me within weeks. The divorce papers were straightforward, but the terms were devastating. Full custody of the children, limited visitation rights, and a clear message that she wanted nothing to do with me. I signed them without protest. What right did I have to fight for a family I had destroyed? The rare moments I got to see Isa and Yuan were bittersweet. They were polite but distant, their smiles forced. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the hurt they didn't yet know how to express. "Why doesn't Mom want to come back?" Isa had asked once, her voice small and trembling. I had no answer for her, only empty reassurances that everything would be okay. As for Morag, she became a ghost of my past. I didn't hear from her, nor did I try to reach out. The connection that had once felt so intoxicating now felt like a curse, a reminder of my weakest moment. I didn't even know where she had gone, and a part of me was relieved. Facing her would have been unbearable. In the weeks and months that followed, I began to reflect on my choices. What had driven me to betray the woman I loved? Was it the thrill of the forbidden? The need to feel wanted? Or was it something deeper, a dissatisfaction within myself that I had refused to confront? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: I had allowed my selfish desires to destroy everything that mattered. Therapy became my lifeline. At first, I went reluctantly, forced by the overwhelming weight of guilt. But over time, it became a place where I could confront my actions and begin to understand the damage I had caused. My therapist didn't offer absolution, there was none to be had, but she helped me see the patterns that had led to my downfall. She helped me recognize the cracks in my life that I had ignored, the unmet needs I had sought to fill in all the wrong ways. Even with therapy, the road to healing was long and painful. I learned to live with the consequences of my actions, though the weight of my choices never fully lifted. The guilt remained, a constant reminder of what I had lost. But with time, I began to find moments of clarity, moments where I could see a path forward. Fiona eventually remarried, and though it stung, I was genuinely happy for her. She deserved someone who could give her the love and loyalty I had failed to provide. I remained in the periphery of my children's lives, trying to rebuild their trust one step at a time. It wasn't easy, and some days felt like a losing battle, but I held on to the hope that one day, they might forgive me. As for Morag, I never saw her again. She became a distant memory, a painful chapter in my life that I chose not to revisit. I often wondered if she had found peace, if she had come to terms with what we had done. But in the end, it didn't matter. The damage was done, and we both had to live with the consequences. Looking back, I realize how fragile trust can be and how easily it can be shattered by a single moment of weakness. The cost of my actions was immeasurable, a painful lesson that I carry with me every day. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that no fleeting desire is worth the destruction of what truly matters. The aftermath of my betrayal left scars, not just on those I had hurt, but also on myself. The years that followed were a journey of reflection and reckoning, filled with lessons I wish I had learned before it was too late. I discovered that healing is not a destination, but a process, a slow, painful process that requires facing the truth about oneself. The most difficult part was accepting that some things could never be undone. Fiona moved on, building a new life with someone who could give her the love and respect she deserved. Seeing her happy again was bittersweet. I knew she deserved every ounce of that happiness, but it was a constant reminder of what I had thrown away. My children were a different challenge. They carried their own pain, their own confusion about why their family had fallen apart. Rebuilding their trust took years, and even now, I wonder if they've fully forgiven me. Through therapy, I came to understand the emptiness that had driven me to seek validation in the wrong places. It wasn't about Morag, not really. She was simply a symptom of a larger problem, a reflection of my own insecurities and unmet needs. I had allowed myself to believe that the excitement and attention she offered could fill the void inside me. But all it did was leave me hollow, surrounded by the ruins of the life I had built. If I could speak to the man I was back then, I would tell him to open his eyes to what he already had. I would tell him that the thrill of the forbidden is fleeting, but the damage it leaves behind can last a lifetime. I would remind him that real love, the kind worth fighting for, isn't always exciting or glamorous, it's steady, it's patient, and it's built on trust. There are moments when I still find myself overwhelmed by guilt. A familiar smell, a fleeting memory, or even an old photograph can bring it all rushing back. But I've learned not to let those moments define me. Instead, I use them as reminders of how far I've come and how much I've grown. I can't undo the past, but I can strive to be a better man in the present, for my children, for myself, and for anyone else who might come into my life. One of the most surprising lessons I've learned is the power of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving myself. I spent years punishing myself for what I had done, as if my guilt could somehow atone for my mistakes. But all it did was keep me trapped in the past, unable to move forward. Forgiving myself didn't mean forgetting what I had done or excusing it, it meant acknowledging my humanity and committing to never make the same mistakes again. If there's a moral to my story, it's this: temptation will always exist, but it's the choices we make in those moments that define us. No fleeting desire is worth the loss of trust, the pain of betrayal, or the destruction of what truly matters. Love requires effort, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the people who matter most. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. Today, I try to live a life that reflects those lessons. I focus on being present for my children, on showing them through my actions that I am someone they can rely on. I've learned to find fulfillment not in fleeting moments of excitement, but in the quiet, steady joys of everyday life. And though the scars of my past remain, they serve as a reminder of how far I've come, and how much further I still have to go. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done differently? Have you ever faced a moment of temptation that changed your life forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that explore the depths of love, betrayal, and redemption. Stay tuned, our next story might just leave you speechless.